In the midst of a pandemic, a virus too small to see has changed our lives in ways once too big to fathom. Yet if we are to get back to life as we once knew it, a viral game of hide-and-seek must end. Which brings us to the scientific equivalent of turning on a light, or in this case, a test, 2 of them. First one is one you likely know well, although probably not by its name. PCR, or polymerase chain reaction testing. It starts like this. Oof. Once collected, the cells on the end of that swab head to a lab, where lab techs attempt to turn RNA into DNA with the help of enzymes. Don't worry, there won't be a test on that. Just know if you had the virus, odds are the PCR test will find it. But what about those who had it? Scientists call the second test a serological test. We'll call it an antibody test. Why? Because the test actively looks for antibodies in the blood. Antibodies produced to fight off disease. If you had the novel coronavirus, even if you didn't know it, you will have antibodies, and those antibodies provide a level of immunity. It's thought at least 1 in 5 infected with the virus don't show symptoms. But anyone with antibodies could go back to work, back to school, back to ERs or ORs without fear of infection. The more we test, the more we'll know what a virus too small to see has been up to. Millions of tests might be necessary, each to help us seek not just where the virus hides, but where it's hidden. The sooner we know that, the better the odds of us putting an end to this deadly game. Think of it like a spigot. Turn it on all the way and growth inevitably follows. Last year's water flowed freely. Our economy grew $21.2 trillion worth of goods and services. And then this year, a virus began turning our daily personal interactions into a poison. Worried about infections overwhelming the medical system, states started closing the spigot in an effort to choke the virus. A once roaring economy turned into a trickle, and unemployment surged by 22 million in just 4 weeks. This is the reality governors now face as they contemplate how far to turn the spigot, how much to reopen the economy. The first turns are likely to be slow, measured. Some businesses would reopen, but not all. Many who work at home would still work at home. Here's the problem. Turn it too much, and the virus has room to return. Hospitalizations and deaths could spike once again. Turn it too little, and the economy continues to sputter. Unemployment fails to go down. More businesses close for good. It's why you're likely to see incremental turns of that spigot. Turn it a little, see what happens. Turn it a little more, see what happens. Find the right amount of turning to grow the economy, not the virus. A challenge indeed for an economy in need of so much more than a trickle to keep it going. Without context, numbers appear chaotic, as erratic as a gust of wind. Without context,
for pneumonia outbreak in the city of Wuhan.
Numbers like 48 and 60 mean little, but give it a moment, because soon enough they will.
Coronavirus.
10 days after the Centers for Disease Control warned U.S. doctors of an outbreak of pneumonia in Wuhan, China, the CDC tested its first patient.
Global concern about
This
a
new coronavirus strain
is to detect this virus early.
It found its first case 3 days later,
A man in Washington state.
In his 30s.
when a test found it in Washington state.
First confirmed U.S. case of the contagious coronavirus.
Following day, the president
We have it totally under control.
appeared unfazed.
It's going to be just fine.
And day after day after day, all was fine, until one day, someone suggested maybe it wasn't.
We don't know the accuracy of this test.
Not that it stopped an anxious CDC from sending those tests to various state labs, but there was clearly a problem. Supplied with the new kits, states managed to test no more than 1, 0, 3, or 2 samples per day. Finally, by mid-February, the CDC admitted
They were getting indeterminate answers.
the tests it had sent states had not worked well.
So we're taking a little extra time here.
Flawed results stalled testing nationwide. 69 samples tested, 63 samples tested. By the time the CDC remedied the problem with the tests, the president suggested the low case counts were a good sign.
So far, we have lost nobody to coronavirus in the United States.
The next day, nobody turned into 1.
Tragic news.
Now the first U.S. death.
It was a male in his 50s.
This is still rapidly unfolding.
Then 1 turned into 6, which turned into 14.
Anybody that wants a test can get a test.
Context. In a country of more than 327 million, that day, the 48th day of testing, little more than 2,900 had received a test. Little more than 2,900, less than 1/100th of 1% of the country. Context. In 48 days, the U.S. had managed to test, on average, roughly 5 dozen people per day. As patients sought limited testing, cases doubled every 2 days. 400, 1,300.
Now have the capacity to test up to 75,000 people for COVID-19.
That day, the U.S. had tested roughly 6% of that number, roughly 5,000 in all tested. Deaths remained rare, 43, 51. Yet that day,
That is a failing.
And a failing, yes.
It is a failing. I mean, let's admit it.
Dr. Anthony Fauci finally said what anybody who wanted a test already knew.
The idea of anybody getting it easily, the way people in other countries are doing it, we're not set up for that. Do I think we should be? Yes, but we're not.
The following day, 1,300 positive cases and at least 55 deaths.
We therefore expect up to 500,000 additional tests will be available early next week.
It would take another 13 days for the country to test 500,000. 13 days of more cases and a rapid increase in deaths. 100, 200, 400, 700, 1,200. By the time the country tested 500,000, the country had confirmed more than 86,000 positive cases.
We're just learning about this for the first time.
A statewide order for people to stay at home.
And by the time the country tested 1 million, more than 3,800 were dead.
The death toll is rising.
We are in the surge, yes.
Context. During the first 48 days of testing, the country managed to test roughly 5 dozen patients a day. More than a month later, we are still trying to understand the ramifications of that, at a time when even now, anyone who wants a test still can't get a test. Good old soap. For years, it was good at 2 things, cleaning and giving kids a reason to avoid curse words. Ick. Let's talk the former, not the latter. By now you've heard about the 20-second rule. Wash your hands with soap and water for 20 seconds. But why do we do that? Why? Why? Here's why. Take a close look, a really close look at soap, and you'll see this. A molecule. One side loves water, the other loves fat, hates water. Put soap and water next to oil, let's say, and the soap molecules go to work. Water-loving side goes toward water, fat-loving side goes toward the oil. That's why soap does such a good job of cleaning your gross, grimy dishes. Now let's see it interact with the novel coronavirus, named because of those weird things sticking out. Those things allow the virus to enter your lung cells, and that's a bad thing. The outer layer of the virus has a weakness, the water-hating, fat-loving side of the soap molecule. See that? That outer layer, scientists call it a membrane of oily lipid molecules. That outer layer is no match for soap. Each one pries the membrane apart, exposing the water-soluble inside of the virus to, yes, water. Eventually, soap forms a bubble around the bad stuff. Scientists call it a micelle. Add more water, and it all washes away. So why 20 seconds? Look at your hands. No, seriously. Look at your hands. See all those lines? Viruses like to get in those. More soap time, more time to clean those cracks. Hand sanitizer, yeah, it works too, thanks in no small part to alcohol, which, through a sciencey term known as denaturing, works to destroy the virus. Key is to have at least 60% alcohol. So yeah, that vodka in your cabinet probably won't work. Save that for something else. Like, say, celebrating the real cool thing about soap. So get going and start counting. 1, 2, 3, 20 seconds. Should do the trick. Yay, soap. C-O-H-O-R-T. Look that up in the dictionary, and you might find this, an ancient Roman military unit. We're not going to talk about that type of cohort. No, let's talk about another definition, because chances are schools are going to be talking a lot more about cohorts thanks to COVID. Yet remember that? School leaders consider the best way to get kids back inside schools. They'll likely consider cohorting, a common term in sociology and education that's about to get its debut on a more national stage. Think of it like this. Many moons ago, I was a member of Denver's Thomas Jefferson High School class of 1992. Yeah, I know, I ain't no spring chicken. Technically, my 200 or so member class of 92 was a cohort, a group. Schools have all sorts of cohorts who tend not to intermingle with other cohorts, which in a building trying to limit the spread of an infectious disease could prove valuable. Look at it this way. Smith Elementary has 1,000 students all in the same building, all who intermingle. Now let's say little Johnny gets sick. Johnny infects Timmy, who infects Billy and Sally, who infect Frankie, Julie, and Katie. This school will need to close, at least temporarily, and keep all 1,000 students, sick or not, out. Which is why schools will attempt to cohort. Let's say Johnny gets sick, but this time Johnny's in a 50-person group that doesn't interact with the other 950. So maybe Timmy, who's in Johnny's cohort, gets sick, but Billy and Sally and Frankie and Julie and Katie have no interaction with that cohort and thus never get sick. You'd still have to have Johnny's cohort stay home and wait for the risk to pass, but the other 950 still could go to school safely. The smaller the cohort, the smaller the number of students at risk when someone turns up sick. And now you know M-O-R-E about C-O-H-O-R-T. Nope, not that definition, the other one. Thanks, guys. You can go home now.